Welcome to today's gathering hosted by the Chinese American Civic Association, or CACA, a nonprofit organization based in Bellevue since July 2019. My name is Victor, a volunteer at CACA, and I'm pleased to host today's presentation. CACA is committed to serving the local Chinese community and promoting its influence in various aspects, while taking pride in this diverse range of programs, which include the Youth Leadership Enhancement Program, among others. This program serves as a platform for young Chinese Americans to develop their leadership skills and make a positive impact. As we celebrate Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, we are thrilled to expand our efforts beyond the Chinese community and collaborate with school districts and local government agencies in Western Washington State. Through our partnership with the Bellevue School District, we have organized a wide range of engaging activities for students. By engaging in Chinese classical dance, 古筝, Chinese painting, paper cutting, Tai Chi, Kung Fu, lion dance, and dragon dance, students can explore and embrace the rich traditions of our heritage while celebrating cultural diversity. In addition, we have curated exhibits honoring the remarkable contributions of Chinese railroad workers displayed in the prominent city government agencies and community spaces such as the City of Bellevue, the City of Linwood, the Olympia Center, and Renton Technical College. By showcasing their legacy, we aim to inspire future generations with their resilience and perseverance. As part of our Asian Pacific American Heritage Month activities today, we are privileged to have a distinguished guest speaker, David Y. Lei, who will share the history of San Francisco's Chinatown. We thank you for joining us in this celebration of heritage, diversity, and unity. Let's embark on this enlightening journey together, embracing the power of knowledge and storytelling. Before we begin the lecture, let me, on behalf of CACA, welcome David Lei. Born in Taiwan with Cantonese parents, David Y. Lei Li Xuanyi has lived in the Bay Area since 1956. He attended public schools and graduated from UC Berkeley in 1972 with a business degree. Lei worked as a social worker in San Francisco's Chinatown with at-risk youths for many years. He has given various talks on a Chinese American history and culture at the Commonwealth Club, California Historical Society, Asian Art Museum, Chinese Culture Center, San Francisco Main Library, and was a commencement speaker to UC Berkeley's class of 2019 at Memorial Stadium. Lei remains as active in the community as ever, working to introduce sustainable funding models to community-based organizations. He feels that it is imperative to interpret Chinese American history and Chinese art and culture in the American context. Thank you and enjoy the lecture. For this first part, we will be focusing on the Transcontinental Railroad, a different narrative. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor, for the introduction. Yes, I'll talk about San Francisco's Chinatown another time, but I'll start with this Golden Spike, the 150th anniversary of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad 4 years ago. So this talk was, I prepared 4 years ago, so some of the dates on this will be 4 years off. But when asked, when Chinese are asked what were our contribution to America, and 90% of the time we will answer, oh, we built the Transcontinental Railroad. But I have slightly different perspective on this that I would like to share with you. First of all, the Transcontinental Railroad we talk about, the Central Pacific, which was the western portion, built maybe 80–90% by the Chinese, in terms that we provided the labor. Because the Chinese were available, we worked cheaper than the Irish, who were building the railroad from the East Coast to Utah. And the Chinese, we built mainly the West Coast portion. So that is what most people say. Well, I want to bring up a few points. Number one is that this railroad that was completed in 1869 was actually the second transcontinental railroad. There was one built before the 1869 transcontinental railroad, and by transcontinental we mean covering the whole continent from the Pacific to the Atlantic. And that was done 14 years before the completion of the second transcontinental railroad. And you can see by the stamp 1855, this was completed. It was the Panama Canal Railroad. And that was completed 14 years before the one everyone refers to. And the Chinese helped with the building of this one as well. There were 700 Chinese recruited to build this railroad that was completed 14 years ahead of the one we always refer to. Now, the one we always refer to is this one. And this picture showing the completion. And most Chinese up until recently say the Chinese were left out of this picture. Some say purposely left out of this picture. And this picture was taken by A.J. Russell, and it's called East-West Shaking Hand. And it's very dramatic because you see the two trains together. Champagne is being passed, two persons shaking hands, and both sides. But if you look carefully, really, you don't really see the Chinese faces here. And that is a complaint by many of the Chinese Americans saying the Chinese helped build this and yet were excluded from this iconic picture that represent the completion of the railroad. Well, if we dig deeper and see when this picture was taken, this picture was actually posed and taken after the ceremony. So this is not the actual ceremony itself, but afterwards, and they set it up to pose it. And the two persons shaking hands, they are the engineers. They're not the president of the railroad. They're not Leland Stanford, which represented the Central Railroad, nor Thomas Durant, who represented the Union, the Pacific, which is the eastern portion. So this was taken later on. We have to realize in the 1860s, photography was very different, very cumbersome. The equipment were very heavy, and it took a long time for exposure. So everyone has to stand still for 3 seconds to 5 seconds for the exposure to take a clear picture. So here we have a picture at the ceremony at Promontory Summit. So this is one, you can see the trains are not together. We see one of the train, the smokestack, towards us, and the other train is about 150 feet away in the distance. And here you can see the trains are apart. The tracks are laid to here. They're not completed because for the ceremony, they would lay a rail for the western side and lay a rail for the eastern side to show the final completion. Each one of these rails are 28 feet. So the trains are at least 60 feet apart. They have to be, but in reality, it looks like they're about 150 apart, 150 feet apart. Then here, they put in the rails, but they're having invocation, they're having their speeches. And here is when it finally were joined, a telegraph was sent out to let everyone know this project is finally completed. Now, during the laying of the last two rails, We know this is Chinese. We can tell by the clothes they wear. The upper jacket is longer and it's kind of droopy, and their pants are kind of droopy. So we have arrows showing where the Chinese were. Actually, there were 8 Chinese at this ceremony to put in the last rail and put in the last spikes. So this is also A.J. Russell, his pictures, and on the back of it, he wrote Chinese at laying last rail. So we know the Chinese they were there at the ceremony and they lay the last rail. Now, this is on May 10th, 1869. For the western portion, it was completed May 1st. So, of course, the railroad, they're not going to have Chinese stay around for 10 days until the ceremony. So they let all the Chinese go already, but they selected 8 to participate in the ceremony. And so there were very few Chinese that were there because the camp where the Chinese camp was maybe 10 miles away, Camp Victory. So, but they selected 8 that were involved with the actual ceremony. And it's shown here by the picture. And then we have a newspaper article, New York Herald, May 12th. It's not 1969, it's 1869. And this says, a chosen party of skilled Chinese leveled the ground and laid the last few ties and the last pair of rails. So it's documented that the Chinese, this is 2 days after the ceremony in New York, they published that the Chinese were there and put in the last rails. And this is a painting commissioned by Leland Stanford, who's in the middle. But painting, you can put in, do whatever you want. But Leland Stanford made sure that the Chinese were there at the ceremony in this painting, putting in the last spike. Now back to the original picture that most Chinese Americans say that the Chinese were purposely left out. But if you look closely, on the right-hand side, the person stooping down is a Chinese. And the person next to him, where the hat is kind of covering, could possibly be a Chinese because of the clothing. And this is discovered by Stanford University recently. They look at all the clothes, but the Chinese are not facing the camera. And my guess is this: it takes 3 to 5 seconds for exposure time. And so the photographer probably shouted out instruction. I'm going to take a picture. Everybody stand still for 5 seconds. Well, the people that spoke English understood and they stood still. But these 2 Chinese probably did not understand. So obviously they were moving and out of focus, but we can tell by the clothes that they're Chinese. So we can say Chinese were in this picture, but not seen. So where were the Chinese when that picture was taken? Well, from this article, May 15, 1869, is a California newspaper. It says, Mr. Strobridge, when work was all over. Now, Strobridge is James Strobridge. He was in charge of all construction for the Central Pacific. So he's the one that hired all the Chinese and managed all the Chinese. So it states, when work was all over, invited the Chinamen who had been brought over from Victory. That's the last camp they were at, for the purpose to dine in his boarding car. When they enter, all the guests and officers present cheer them as the chosen representatives of the race which have greatly helped to build the road, a tribute they well deserve and which evidently gave them much pleasure. So this article is stating after the ceremony, after the Golden Spike ceremony, James Strobridge invited the Chinese, the 8 Chinese that represented all the Chinese, to his personal car, and he invited the other VIP to his car to toast the Chinese and to thank the Chinese. So when that picture was taken, the Chinese were being toasted and honored. And this picture always troubled me when I first saw it. These men looked in their 70s or 80s. And the caption when I first saw it was Chinese railroad workers. I said, oh my gosh, they're hiring these old people to build the railroad. Then later on, I found out this was actually 50 years later. It was at the 50th anniversary of the Golden Spike, 1919, and it was at Ogden, Utah. And they made an effort to look for the 8 Chinese that were at the original ceremony. They found 3 of them, and we have their names on the bottom. And they transported these 3 to Ogden, Utah, built a float for them, and put them on the float, and reminding everyone the Chinese helped build the railroad. So at the 50th anniversary, they did not forget that the Chinese did this. But at the 100th anniversary, when Phil Choi was there to represent the Chinese with the Chinese Historical Society of America, he was told last minute that he doesn't have his 5 minutes on stage. So the person in charge of the stage forgot about it. That person said they ran out of time, but the Chinese were invited to come, and he was told he will have 5 minutes on stage. But last minute, he was told he doesn't have the time. So a lot of people are very upset about this, that the 50th anniversary, they did not forget. And at the 150th, we made sure the Chinese were not forgotten. So this is a picture of James Strobridge. Now, there's a lot of stories. James Strobridge was head of construction for the Central Pacific. And there's a lot of stories about him not liking the Chinese, very tough on the Chinese. He did not want to hire the Chinese, but it took Charles Crocker, his boss, to tell him when they couldn't find any white workers, and they claimed Charles Crocker told Strobridge, didn't the Chinese build the Great Wall? If they can build the Great Wall, they can build the railroad. So Charles Crocker forced Strobridge to hire a few Chinese to test. I think that story is made up by Charles Crocker's media group to give Charles Crocker the credit. Because if we dig deeper and look into the 1852 census. Now, California became a state in 1850, so they have to take a special census to see how many representative California should have. So if we look into the 1852 census, we see James Strobridge is the star on the bottom is James Strobridge. You can go online and find this 1852 census, James Strobridge. And on top here, starting here, it says Chinese on this side. And these are all Chinese. He had 18 Chinese living with him, working for him. So in 1852, he was already hiring Chinese working for him at his ranch and at his hotel. And one of the persons named Ah Toy. Later on, we found out Ah Toy was one of the first to be hired by the Central Pacific in 1863. And later on, he became the supervisor for all the Chinese under Strobridge. So this only makes sense that Strobridge would hire the people that had worked for him. And we know Strobridge had worked on other railroads like the Sacramento to Marysville Railroad, the San Francisco to San Jose railroads. And these railroads were built years before the Central Pacific Railroad. So James and the Chinese worked on these railroads. So Strobridge had worked with Chinese before. And there's no doubt in my mind that someone who hired Chinese to work for him 10 years before he became head of construction of the Central Pacific would go back to these workers to work for him. And then we have these paintings of Chinese working, hanging from baskets, saying that that's one of the contributions the Chinese made to the railroad. But I think this is wrong. And also the Chinese lifting the rails are not really proper. We only have paintings of these. We don't have actual pictures. And we don't have any documentation, any writing about Chinese hanging from baskets during the time of the constructions of the railroad. We have this after 1869. And this painting's by Jake Lee and is at the Chinese Historical Society of America, but he didn't paint these until the 1960s, about 100 years after the fact. Now, I have problems with these because it made no sense to me why Chinese would hang from baskets. As you can see on the top, you have to assign at least 3 people up there, and you have to set up a pulley system to hang from the baskets. And you look at the cliff, it has to be 90 degrees. It has to be exactly 90 degrees to hang. Now, all along the route of the Central Pacific from Sacramento to Promontory Summit, there's no place along the route that is 90 degrees. The steepest is at Cape Horn, and that's 75 degrees only. So there's no way to physically hang baskets if it's less than 90 degrees. So I have doubts that this ever happened. And it takes 8 people to lift the rail, and the Chinese didn't do it. This was a job for the Irish, and there's a special tool to lift the rail. So this painting, there's a lot of issues with these paintings. So with paintings, you just can't really trust. We do have pictures of railroad workers for the Central Pacific using a bosun's chair. That's just a rope with a plank, a wooden plank on the bottom. You tie one end to a tree or a boulder, and you can just propel yourself down. You can go left and right. You can pull yourself up. It makes much more sense than to have all these people stand around, and you can only go up and down. You can't go left and right. So these are some of the stories I have problems with that we need to go back and really research and see what are the real stories. So for the 150th anniversary, we had about 700 people go to Utah to celebrate it. But then I always felt the people that go to these conferences, they're the ones that already know the Chinese built the Central Pacific, at least 80, 90% of the workers. It is all Americans, all the mainstream Americans, we need to tell the story. And the Chinese American Heritage Foundation, they did this by putting a float in the Pasadena Rose Bowl Parade. And 75 million people saw this float to tell the story to celebrate the 150th anniversary. So this is the basis of another narrative of the Chinese working on the railroad. If my ancestor worked on the railroad, I would honor them. I would think this is a great thing because under very hard, difficult circumstances, they stayed. Half of them stayed in America, half of them went back to China. And the ones that stayed through very difficult time, very racist time, established a toehold for people like us to come later on. However, as achievement, I don't think much of it because we were the laborers, because we were available, we worked efficiently, we worked cheaper than the other people. But we really didn't do the engineering, we didn't do the surveying, we didn't do the management, we didn't do the funding, we didn't do the bulk of it. So my analogy is today the iPhone and iPad is made in Shenzhen, China by a Taiwan company called Foxconn. And they pay pretty well by China standards. So if I were to work in Foxconn today, I can tell all my friends, I make the iPhone and the iPad. And then my friends would say, doesn't Apple Computer have something to do with this? Because all you're doing is providing the labor. So that's my analogy. Yes, it's important that we were available and we worked on it, but it was a lot more to it than that. So my next talk would be about our true contribution to America. But in terms of the railroad, this is it. Maybe I can take questions another time, but 谢谢, this is 螃蟹. So I take 2, so it becomes 谢谢.
That's pretty good. Yeah, thank you so much, David. Very insightful, very interesting. And not only is like you bring about like so many of these Chinese contributions and like all these significant events, it's also very thorough, very logical, very realistic. And I actually appreciate that a lot. Yeah.
Yes, you have any other questions? If anyone wish documentation on all the points I brought out, I'm more than happy to provide them newspaper articles and so forth. But I think before we really tell the story and our contribution on building the railroad, we need to look at the history a bit more, or people can challenge us on what we say. So this is something I feel is very important, that we must really research our own history instead of just relying on what we hear. We need proof.
Right. Well, yeah, I think that's a very, very beautiful ending to this segment. And after this short break, we'll be back.
Okay.